teachings for the rest of this year to talk about things that we find in our churches and how they help us in our Catholic life, and how we might use them in evangelization. This week, I've decided to talk about something that we quite often see in our churches, that is relics, and in particular the relics that are touring England and Wales at the moment, a relics pilgrimage of the relics of Saint Bernadette, and I saw them in St. George's Cathedral in our archdiocese recently. I took a few photos, so you might know what I'm talking. In the first one, you might see, I believe in Orthodox icons there is a tradition when painting Our Lady to always paint Jesus in the painting as well, because we worship Jesus through Mary. So I did try and get the tabernacle in this picture, but it's very small. You'd have to do it very hard, but that was the intention. But this is the reliquary of Saint Bernadette, and inside this reliquary will be part of her mortal remains. I didn't peek in and see exactly which, but this is the object that's being held up in veneration in cathedrals and churches around the country at the moment. So I thought I'd start by just thinking a little about who Saint Bernadette was. And I'm going to start with a secular history book. So not a hagiography, it's a book about the history of France. And it relates how in 1858, a 14-year-old girl in a rural town in the Pyrenees, and we struggle to imagine the state of rural poverty in these times, before all the conveniences we like. But if you just a little taste of it here, it said, her father had lost an eye while roughening up a millstone with a chisel, and then the new owner of the mill had turned them out. A year before Bernadette's visit to the shrine at Betheram, her father had been accused of stealing 2 bags of flour. Winter work was hard to find, and the family had been forced to move from the district where they once lived to the medieval prison that was now used to house the indigent. They were cold, hungry, and desperate. So this is 14-year-old Bernadette Subaru, asthmatic, but brought up in the faith. And the author here, Graham Robb, goes on to describe the first apparition. So it was on common land where poor people gathered fuel and swineherds bought their pigs. As Bernadette was removing her stockings to cross the canal, she heard a sudden gust of wind coming from the cave. Looking up a few feet above the entrance, she saw a tiny figure dressed in white. It was no taller than herself, 4'7". It wore a blue sash and a yellow rose on each foot. She later described it as "une petite damiselle," or in French, "une petite demoiselle." The figure reminded her of a 12-year-old girl she knew who often wore a white dress. So we have this picture of a 14-year-old peasant girl, essentially, and there's this apparition of the Virgin Mary in her life. And the apparitions continued, and they form an interesting pattern. At the beginning, the lady, the demoiselle, didn't reveal herself, but just enjoyed Bernadette's company. There's a story that apparently Bernadette didn't know who she was, but would sprinkle her with holy water, the idea being that if she was from God, she could stay. If not, she could get lost. So we have Bernadette responding to the apparitions. And then the middle set of apparitions were considered to be penitential. Our Lady revealed some great sorrows, we think. And all the time crowds were growing. And then in the there are 18 apparitions, I think, and maybe the 17th or 18th, Our Lady became very joyful and revealed herself as the Immaculate Conception. So we have this picture of Saint Bernadette, and we now have her relics in our churches. And I want to piece together what we can take from that, because in a sense it's very weird to have dead body parts in our churches, and so much so when we consider in the Jewish law, dead bodies were to be avoided at all costs. So we think of the story of the Good Samaritan, where the priest crosses the road to avoid the dead body, and we wonder why this is and why we don't treat dead bodies like that. I want to concentrate on the first few chapters of the Gospel of Mark, because I think they're appropriate here. And in the first public acts of Jesus, we see his miracle working, his casting out demons, but especially we see his the healing that he brings. And there are 3 episodes I want to bring out in the first few chapters of Mark. The first is where Jesus cleanses a leper. Mark tells us that Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. And when he was cleansed, he said to the leper, "Go show yourself to the priest." The next episode is where Jesus healed a woman who'd been suffering a hemorrhage. So, a loss of blood. The one where Jesus asks, "Who touched my clothes?" And he felt the power go out of him. And the third episode, shortly after, is where Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. And Mark says, he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." So here we see Jesus intentionally touching unclean people. And I want to see what we mean by this notion of unclean, because it's one of the big themes of Mark's gospel. And in Jewish thought, we tend to think of clean and unclean as kind of moral categories, but that's not quite what the Jewish understanding of clean and unclean. So the Jewish remember God as the creator of all things, one who brought life into the world, into the universe. And they saw bodies are breaking down as bodies where the life was receding from them. And so unclean bodies were ones that couldn't be in the presence of the Lord because life was receding from them. So that's why unclean couldn't go to the temple. And Jesus' first word to the leper was, "Go show yourself to the priest." So that's, so he could enter the temple. So we have this notion of life going out of bodies. And that culminates in Jesus' great teaching about cleanliness in chapter 7, where he says, "There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that go out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come." So we have Jesus who by his new life, turns unclean into clean. And, that's why he touches lepers, touches the lady with the hemorrhage, touches the dead body of Jairus' daughter. And because Jesus is this new life, and by his grace, when this new life enters the world, there is no uncleanliness in his saints, in the people, through his grace have been made clean. And this brings us to the great example of the saints that we see throughout history. We start with Our Lady, full of grace, as the angel announced. She who is without sin because of this great grace. And, we see her appearing, in this historical account, we see her appearing to Saint Bernadette. And, I'm speaking on the Feast of All Saints, where we know that there are countless holy men of God, holy men and women of God all throughout history. And certain of them we can recognize by the healing they've brought. So they've come into the world. So, we've seen at Lourdes, over time, these miracles, these healings that are a sign of the grace that Christ is pouring out in the world. And so we have saints that we can emulate, that we know it's possible, and we can know this on an intellectual level, but we can also know it. We see relics as concrete examples of people who have been made clean on the inside by the grace of Christ, and so we venerate them as a sign that if we can cooperate with God's grace, we too will be clean. And that's why Pope Benedict XVI tells us, by inviting us to venerate the mortal remains of the martyrs and saints, the Church does not forget that, in the end, these are indeed just human bones, but they are bones that belonged to individuals touched by the transcendent power of God. The relics of the saints are traces of that invisible but real presence which sheds light on the shadows of the world and reveals the kingdom of heaven in our midst. So, that's the role that relics can play in our life. How can they be tools for evangelization? Now, in many ways, I could not think of anything more designed to offend Protestants than venerating bones because of an apparition by Our Lady. So I get it. These very Catholic ideas may not be the most obvious of evangelical tools, but in the world today, we constantly need reminding of the value of our bodies. That there's so much confusion about whether our bodies are just vehicles that our soul drives around while we're on this planet, and confusion about what we are, and what we are is body and soul, created by God, and that, I think, is the message we take to the world, that we can use to remind people that we are created, and we're loved, and we are redeemed. So I would like to take that message yourselves and ponder these things, and we will see you next time. God bless.